an interesting subject, looking at ISIS, because for many people it is a bit of a puzzle. Where does it fit in with Bible prophecy? Is this the power that is going to come against Israel? Or are they even spoken about in Bible prophecy? Well, that's what we're going to be looking at and discovering for ourselves. But who are ISIS? Well, they go under several titles. ISIS is the phrase I use, the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, or the S can be al-Sham, which is the ancient name for Syria, so that's the meaning of ISIS. ISIL is very similar, the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant being the area around Syria and Iraq. But they like to call themselves now the Islamic State. That's what they like to be known by, that they are an Islamic State, and their purpose is to reflect Muslim teaching throughout the world. So that's their preference. They're also known as Daesh or Daesh. Various newspapers use those particular terms, but in the UK we don't hear them very often. Now, ISIS was, I'm going to refer to them by ISIS because it's very difficult to say IS all the time, so ISIS is much easier. So ISIS was set up in 2004 as a group to help Al-Qaeda, and they succeeded in doing that, but there was a great falling out. 2013, Al-Qaeda outlawed ISIS, and really it was from 2013 that they really gained power and very rapidly became quite a force to be reckoned with in the region. Though in the past 12 months or so they have been losing support and have been losing territory. Now the thing to remember is that they are Sunni Muslims. Muslims are divided up into Sunni and Shiite. Saddam Hussein and all his followers were Sunni Muslims, so they are Sunni Muslims. And if we just, this was an interesting piece which was downloaded this morning. It's very difficult to get up-to-date stuff on ISIS unless they just committed an atrocity, which they did on the 14th of the month. But this was from a Hebrew newspaper, Israel Hayom, Israel Today. It's Israel's only free of charge national newspaper. It's one that supports Netanyahu very strongly. And every day the Israeli government puts out a translation of some of the articles which appear in the Hebrew press for the benefit of English-speaking people. So this just caught my eye. I thought it was quite an interesting insight. This is how this Israeli newspaper, very popular newspaper in Israel, looks at ISIS. So this newspaper comments on ISIS extremism and its challenge to Europe and states. What Europe does not understand, or refuses to understand, is that ISIS is not an organisation, and certainly not a state, rather a twisted religious idea, which unfortunately even the Islamic world find hard to explain. The author asserts, at the end of the day, this organisation, built on the tattered ruins of religious interpretations, and mainly on fear-mongering and terrorising, cannot continue to survive for long, other than in the nightmares of the horrified citizens of Europe, and declares the Western world must deal with ISIS and its emissaries with a harsh and uncompromising hand. Most importantly, it cannot show fear, because that is what nourishes these organisations. Radical Islam assumes many shapes and forms, and every generation produces its own variety of these groups. Despite their short shelf life, they spread fear and mayhem among us. And of course, the Israelis are, to some extent, fearful of ISIS. They are at the door, they are present in the West Bank, they are present in the Gaza Strip, they are present in Sinai. And so they are a threat to Israel too. Now, they were set up, as I say, to help Al-Qaeda, but in more recent years, they want to proclaim themselves as the representative of the Muslim world. And their aim is against Christianity. And this was the cover of one of their earlier magazines. This is October 2014, showing the ISIS flag flying over St. Peter's in Rome. And their aim was to say, well, you know, one of our aims is to take over Rome. And we shall come back to that in a moment. But as well as conquering Christians, they want to conquer the Sunni Muslims as well as the Shiite Muslims. Although they are Muslim, they are at loggerheads with their own brand of Muslim, Sunni, as well as with Shia. So we need to just locate where they are and just look at the background to the Shia-Sunni split in the Middle East. So ISIS sits itself in the middle there. For some reason, I don't know why the shading around ISIS has not fully gone all the way around, but never mind. So it's imposed itself upon Syria and Iraq, plonked itself in the middle there. Now, as I say, the heart of the Middle East is all Muslim. The Shias are in Iraq and Iran, and the Sunnis are to the west of Iraq and Iran. Iran is 90% Shia, Iraq is about 63%. Saudi Arabia is 95% Sunni, Egypt 90%, Turkey 85%, Syria about 74%, and Yemen about 65%. Now, what we have to remember is that the Middle East was carved up by the British and the French at the end of World War I. And the boundaries which they set for the countries of the Middle East are very artificial ones, and they didn't take into consideration the various religious factions, and that's why, though the Middle East has plodded on for 100 years, the coming of the Arab Spring brought to the fore the religious divide between Sunni and Shia. So those are the lines, very neat lines, which the British and the French drew and said, well, this part will be Syria, that part will be Iraq, that part will be Jordan. The two people concerned were Mark Sykes, the British man, and Picot was the French man. And it was in 1916, so the World War I was in the middle of its process, and Britain and France could see that the Turks were being driven back. And these two men had their secret meeting and decided who would take over which territory and how it would be divided up. So that was just 100 years ago. But it didn't take effect at the end of World War I. It had to wait till the San Remo conference in 1920 when the borders were finally set. And the dates of the independence of these countries are marked on the map. So it's quite interesting to see so many of them are modern countries. You know, we know that Israel 1948, but Jordan was only 2 years before, 1946. Syria 1946, Iraq 1930, Saudi Arabia 1932. So quite a modern phenomenon, the coming of these Arab nations in the Middle East. And say for about a century these borders have held, but the Arab Spring has released the tensions, and then ISIS has come along and added another layer by superimposing itself upon the existing boundaries and establishing itself as a state, a so-called state, claiming to be a state, within the territories of Syria and Iraq. Now, what do they believe? Because this is important, because this is what motivates them. And when one looks at their beliefs, one can find corrupted, twisted scriptures at the basis of it. It is quite interesting. References to the end times fill Islamic State propaganda. It's a big selling point with foreign fighters who want to travel to the lands where the final battles of the apocalypse will take place. The civil wars raging in those countries today, Iraq and Syria, lend credibility to the prophecies. The Islamic State has stoked the apocalyptic fire. For bin Laden's generation, the apocalypse wasn't a great recruiting pitch. Governments in the Middle East 2 decades ago were more stable and sectarianism was more subdued. It was better to recruit by calling to arms against corruption and tyranny than against the Antichrist. Today, though the apocalyptic recruiting pitch makes more sense. So they are recruiting people to come and fight because they believe that they are in the end times. And it concluded the belief in the final day of judgment by God, and specifically a belief that the arrival of one known as the Imam Mahdi is near. ISIL believes that it will defeat the army of Rome at the town of Dabqui in the fulfillment of prophecy. So they believe that the great battle of Armageddon is going to be fought in Syria, and that the events that are happening at the moment are all in preparation for it. So they're saying to their followers, come over and fight for us. We are battling against the Christians. We're battling against Rome. And the battle is going to be held in Syria at this little town of Dabqui. Now, some more from Wikipedia about this particular town. In Islamic eschatology, as found in the Hadith, the area of Dabqui is mentioned as a place of some of the events of the Muslim Mahalim, which would equate to the Christian apocalypse or Armageddon. So this companion of Muhammad reported in his Hadith that Muhammad said the last hour would not come until the Romans land at Dabqui. An army consisting of the best soldiers of the people of the earth at that time will come from Medina to counteract them. So they believe that Rome, and by Rome they mean Christians, are going to invade, and we're going to send out the best of our armies, and there's going to be this great battle, and then their equivalent to the Messiah will be revealed. Scholars and Hadith commentators suggest that the words Romans refers to Christians. The Hadith further relates the subsequent Muslim victory, followed by the peaceful takeover of Constantinople, with invocations of Takbir, God is greater, and Tashhihba, repetition of 3 prayers. And finally, the defeat of Antichrist, following the return and descent of Jesus Christ. So mixed up in all this is the return of Jesus Christ and the defeat of Antichrist. So they're all totally mixed up. One's a defeat of Romans. So into this hodgepodge are their ideas, which are rallying people to come and fight for their cause. Now, Takbir is often translated as God is great. We hear, when terrorists are shooting their victims, they cry out Takbir, which is translated in the papers, God is great. But that's not the proper translation. It's God is greater, and that's their point, that our God, the God of the Muslim God, is greater than the Christian God. And yet how this blends with the descent of Jesus Christ, do not ask me now. It's not worth spending the time to try and fathom what they really believe. But I thought that was of interest. They're very much against history, and so when they take over a place, they destroy the ancient temples. This is Palmyra. That's what it used to be like. It was a World Heritage Site. People used to come to see the archaeology of this ancient site, Greco-Roman ruins. And that was what it used to look like in 2014. And then they came along and besieged it, took it. And if you see the transition, you can see how it's all been pounded to the ground. And just rerun it, that's what it was like. That's what they've done to the ruins. So they're prepared to wipe out any connections to Judaism or the ancient Greek world because of its eventual Christian connections. And they're prepared to use violence to achieve their ends. If you go on Wikipedia, there's a huge long list of all the terrorist attacks that they have been responsible for. I've just picked a few out. One of the most notable ones was the shooting, the downing over Sinai of the Russian jets and all 224 people killed. That was in October of last year. And then a couple of weeks later in Beirut, there was terrible explosions, car bombs, leaving 43 dead and 250 plus injured. And then the following day was the carnage. These are two of the headlines from the newspapers in France, when 129 were killed and 352 plus were wounded. So 3 attacks within 3 weeks killed nearly 400 people, spread from Sinai across to Europe. And so people were very frightened as to where they would next appear. They struck in Belgium in March, killing 32. They struck in Istanbul in June, just less than a month ago, leaving 44 dead there. Baghdad, beginning of this month, 308 dead. And the latest one is at Nice with that lorry driving into the crowds. There was a brother and sister and their family were watching all the parades and that, but fortunately the brother said to his wife, I feel very tired, let's go to the hotel and not watch the fireworks. And they felt very blessed that they had done that because the carnage was terrible. So, where do they get their money from? They're a very rich organisation. They're reckoned to be the richest terrorist organisation. This was an account from The Guardian a couple of years ago. It soon became clear that in less than 3 years, ISIS has grown from a ragtag band of extremists to perhaps the most cash-rich and capable terror group in the world. Well, they got their money from robbing banks when they took over Mosul. There was 1.5 billion. These are American dollars, so I've just forgotten the conversion rate to the Australian ones, but you'll know it, so just mentally do it. But a lot of money just straight out from the banks. They've looted many archaeological sites and reckoned that they got 36 million from just looting the sites. From selling the oil from the territories they've taken over, they get 3 million a day, and who knows what they've got in ransom payments from the people that they've taken captive. So, sources of money which have made them very rich. They are very brutal, as we know, in imposing Sharia law to terrorise people. When they took over Mosul, it was scenes that could have come out from Old Testament times with the Assyrians, and also from more modern times from the Nazis, where they just lined up people in a trench, got them to dig a trench, lined them up, just machine gunned them down. They practice hand choppings, crucifixions, beheadings, hangings, absolutely brutal. And so, because they spread such fear, if they come into a town, the soldiers won't fight back because they're afraid that if they are taken over, they will be brutally murdered. So they flee. And they seem very similar to the ancient Assyrians. The techniques that the Assyrians used, which we read about in the scriptures, are the very techniques which are still being used today by ISIS. And there was this book published in 2009, Extreme Violence in the Visuals and Text of Antiquity, looking at all the monuments and that of the Assyrians, how barbarous they were, and how they used that to spread fear into their victims. And that's exactly what ISIS is doing. Now, the conclusion of the book, don't rush out and buy it because it's in German and it's not a pleasant book at all. Physical violence is a universal in all cultures, the new history book concludes. Whether we will ever see any improvement is hard to say, considering mankind's history to date. And I must admit, when I was younger and used to read in Joel and in Zechariah about them raping the women and all the terrible things, rape and pillage, selling girls as slaves, I used to think, well, that doesn't happen today, but it does, doesn't it? ISIS certainly do, and Boko Haram in Africa do. It's happened in Ukraine. Wherever there is war, soldiers, human nature doesn't change. So the question is ISIS here to stay? Is ISIS the power that is going to be the invader of Israel? Is ISIS the king of the north? Is ISIS Gog? Well, there's a very relevant passage which we read by way of introduction, which we will tease out, which I believe speaks about ISIS of latter day. But before we get there, there are just a few things I want to look at in preparation for reading and expounding what we've read in Numbers chapter 24. There have been several voices within our community that have said that ISIS is the power that's going to invade Israel. It's the Arabs who are the king of the north and make war with Israel and the Lamb. Now, what Scripture teaches us that the enemies of Israel are not the Arabs, but it's false Christianity are Israel's great enemy. And Nebuchadnezzar's image is a representation of the Babylonian power, which was morphed into Christianity, and that is the power that is going to come against Israel. Now, one of the things that's made people point to ISIS as being part of being the beast system was the allegation that Muhammad's name adds up to 666. So here was the mark of the beast. But it doesn't do that at all. In fact, the word Muhammad only adds up to 92 using the scriptural method of allocating numbers to the letters. And the person that put about this idea that it adds up to 666 was this Charles Walmsley, who died in 1797, just to give you a perspective when he lived. He was a Roman Catholic bishop, and at the time the church was trying to divert people's attention from the Protestant expositions of Revelation, pointing to Rome as being the beast, part of the beast system. And this bishop claimed that in ancient writings, Muhammad was known by these two names, Mahometis or Mahometis, and if you apply the maths to those two names, yes, they do add up to 666. But if you examine the sources, and I must admit I haven't done it myself, but those who have done search the writings of these Greek historians, he doesn't mention that at all. It's entirely fictitious. And so, this association of Muhammad with the beast is entirely shaky foundation. So, let's just see where ISIS is and see how it equates with Asher. Now, there are two main rivers that run up or run down into the Persian Gulf, the Tigris and the Euphrates, and ISIS has plonked itself more or less in the middle of that region there. Two main cities, Mosul there and, whoops, sorry, it's on the next one. Go back. Mosul is its main city. It's not its headquarters, but its main cities. And Mosul is the ancient city of Nineveh. If you go into Google Earth and draw down the map of Mosul, you'll see marked there the Nineveh ruins. So this is ancient Nineveh. And we're told in Genesis that Nimrod went into Asher, built Nineveh, Rehoboth, and Calah. So this was one of the cities that Nimrod built, as well as Babel, he built Nineveh. So it is to this area that ISIS has been drawn, and this is their de facto capital, really. Now, the other main city is Asher, in ISIS territory, on the edge of ISIS territory. And again, Asher is the ancient name for Assyria. That's where we get the word Assyria. So the Assyrian Empire, which then led to the Babylonian Empire, which then led to the Medo-Persian and then the Greek Empire. So its origins of the Assyrian Empire are there, and it is into this territory that ISIS has inserted itself, on the territory of the ancient Assyrian Empire. Now, I just want to do a bit of history, and you might think, well, what really has this got to do with ISIS? But just bear with me. So we go from the Assyrian to the Babylonian to the Medo-Persian, and then we have the coming of the Greek Empire with the ram in Daniel chapter 8 with its notable horn, the he-goat representing Greece and Alexander, pushing against the Persian ram. And so this ram has its, the goat, has this notable horn, which represented Alexander the Great, great power, the young man, great conqueror, with his famous horse, Bucephalus, conquered the Medo-Persian Empire in a very short time. And interestingly, having conquered the Ram Empire, he is depicted as wearing a headband. If I just enlarge that area there, you can see how the shape of a ram is on his headband. So he acknowledged that he had taken over the Ram Empire, which I think is quite fascinating. So the Grecian leopard, very swift beast, and very swiftly conquered this territory. But we know at the age of 32, Alexander died, and that notable horn was broken, and in its place came up 4 horns, of which 2 eventually became the stronger, one to the north and one to the south. And in historical time and time of the Greeks, as far as the history of Israel was concerned, Israel was sandwiched between the king of the north, the Seleucid Empire, to the north, and the king of the south, the Ptolemaic Empire, to the south. And as these 2 rival Greek generals fought against each other, Israel was the battleground, Jerusalem was the battleground. But in Daniel chapter 11, this lays the foundation of the history that Daniel outlines in chapter 11, which we haven't time to look at, but he deals with these 2 horns, the king of the north and the king of the south, and their subsequent history. But just going back to Daniel chapter 8, what was important was out of one of these horns came a little horn. And that little horn we know to be the Roman power. And it was Rome that did spring out of the northern power, of Greek power, and it came to the assistance of the northern Greek power, the Seleucids, and then subsequently took them over and then spread southwards into the Ptolemaic and took that over. But the Roman horn sprang out of the Greek Empire. And we know how the Roman Empire was divided into east and west. Now, all that is a foretaste of what is to come to pass in the future. Daniel chapter 11 makes it clear that there is to be a king of the north power, there's to be a king of the south power, they're going to be rivals, Israel's going to be piggy in the middle once again. Now, what we do know is that that was the picture of the Greek Empire. It is a miniature, really, of what is to happen. Because we know from Ezekiel chapter 38 that powers outside that area are going to be the dominant powers. In other words, Russia is going to move into the territory of the King of the North. We know powers like Britain and the Commonwealth countries, Australia and that, are going to be operating in the south, in the King of the South territory. And Armageddon is going to be the clash, not in Syria, but in Israel, between the power of the King of the North coming against Israel. King of the South is not going to be any effective against it, and it will be Christ and the saints who will destroy this King of the North power. But I just want to go to Daniel chapter 11 because this gives us an important clue to where ISIS all fits in. So in Daniel chapter 11, as I say, the whole chapter is a fascinating chapter of exposition of the history of the times and the struggle between the king of the north and the king of the south. It then comes to more modern times at the end. So we're just going to pick it up at the time of the end in verse 40. And at the time of the end shall the king of the south push out him, whoever him is, and the king of the north shall come against him, whoever the him is, like a whirlwind, with chariots and with horsemen and with many ships, and he shall enter into the countries and shall overflow and pass over. He shall enter also into the glorious land. Many countries shall be overthrown, but certain escape, Edom, Moab, and chief of Ammon. He goes down into Egypt, and verse 43 takes over the treasures of gold and silver in Egypt. He's helped by the Libyans and Ethiopians. Tidings trouble him, and he comes upwards into the land of Israel to Jerusalem. In verse 45, he plants the tabernacles of his palace between the seas in the glorious holy mountain, yet he shall come to his end, and none shall help him. So that is a situation which most of it lies in the future. So what is important is to understand who is the him. And in the context of what has gone in earlier verses, the him is the possessor of Constantinople. Now, at the moment, the possessor of Constantinople is Turkey. The Ottoman Empire has been in control of Constantinople since 1453. And at the time of the end, the king of the south pushed at him, drove the Turkish Empire back, confined it to Turkey, but Turkey still possesses Constantinople. So we understand the king of the south, referring to Britain, the role that she had to play in driving the Turks out of the Middle East in order that Israel as a nation and the other nations of the Middle East might come into being. And 100 years has gone by. Britain and Israel are preparing to celebrate the Balfour Declaration end of next year, when Britain opened up a homeland for the Jews to go back to Israel. But then the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind with chariots and many horsemen. And we see that, linking it with Ezekiel 38, as referring to Gog, the power of Russia from the north, will come against the possessor of Constantinople, Turkey, and succeed in taking Constantinople, because that's what the Russians have been wanting to do for many centuries. And having done that, then they come forth into Egypt and into Israel with many ships, well armed, in the language of Daniel's day, chariots and horsemen, many ships, we would say, with aircraft and cruise missiles and all the rest of it. A well-armed force that chooses to come down into Egypt to secure a southern flank and then move up into Israel and plants his tabernacles in Jerusalem between the Dead Sea and the Mediterranean Sea, and comes to his end. Comes to his end when Christ and the saints come up and destroy him in the Battle of Armageddon. Now, if we bear that in mind, and then now come with me to the reading which we took from Numbers chapter 24, I hope we can piece some of these things together. So we know the background to Numbers 24, the parables of Balaam. Moses had led the Israelites out of Egypt through Sinai, up and wandered in the wilderness, and had brought them to the edge of the promised land. And while they were there, probably unbeknown to Moses, though God may have revealed these things to him at the time, the king of Moab was planning to get rid of these Israelites who had come from Egypt 40 years earlier and are now landed on the edge of his territory, and he calls Balaam to come and curse these people that they might perish. So Balak was planning the destruction of Israel. That's what he wanted. He wanted Balaam to bring about the destruction of Israel. And in a sense, he succeeded, didn't he? Because Balaam's final advice was to get him to lure the Israelites to worship the false gods of Moab, and the terrible destruction, 24,000 of the Israelites perished, didn't they? But here we are. Balaam is summoned to the top of Pisgah, that hill there, to look down upon the encampment of Israel. And after the first two parables, we have the third and fourth in this chapter 24, the right chapter. The third parable sets the scene that what Balaam was telling Balak was things that lay in the future. And he sees this picture in verse 5 of how goodly are thy tents, O Jacob, and thy tabernacles, O Israel. As the valleys are they spread forth, as gardens by the riverside, as the trees of ling aloes, which Yahweh hath planted, and as cedar trees beside the water, seeing stability, peacefulness in Israel. He shall pour the water out of his buckets, and his seed shall be in many waters. And his king, Israel's king, shall be higher than Agag, and his kingdom, Israel's kingdom, shall be exalted. God brought him forth out of Egypt. He hath, as it were, the strength of a unicorn. He shall eat up the nations, his enemies, and shall break their bones and pierce through with his arrows. He lay down as a lion, as a great lion. Who shall stir him up? Blessed is he that blesseth thee, and cursed is he that curseth thee. So referring to Israel. So now how upset Balak was, because here was a prophecy that said that in some future time, Israel is going to have a king, and their king is going to be higher than Agag. Agag means I shall be head. And the Septuagint version translates it not as Agag, but as Gog, picking up Ezekiel 38, which is the meaning there. Now we understand that Agag was the title of the Amalekite leaders. A bit like Pharaoh was for the Egyptians. Now we know the Amalekites, well, like the Moabites, were bent on the destruction of Israel. When Israel first came out of Egypt, as they were journeying to Sinai, it was the Amalekites that attacked Israel from the rear, and it was Joshua who is revealed to us as the saviour of Israel, defeating that Amalekite attack. And here we are at the end of the journey, and God is using similar language: Agag, Amalekites, people that hate Israel, seek their destruction, exactly as Balak was doing, and uses it to paint this picture of a future time when there again would be a nation that sought Israel's destruction, but Israel's king was going to be stronger, and this Agag, I will be head, would no longer be head, because this power, this Israel's king, would be like a lion, like a great lion. So that was quite a disturbing parable that Balaam uttered. Balak was most upset that once again Balaam hadn't cursed this people that he'd asked him to come and curse, but instead was saying, well, whoever curses Israel is going to be cursed themselves. And so finally Balaam goes and gives his final, under divine inspiration, gives his final parable about Israel to Balaam. And he says in verse 14, I will advertise thee, I will tell you what this people, that you're wanting me to curse, shall do to your people in the latter days. So that clearly tells us we're looking to the future. And he sees in verse 17, I see him, but not now. I shall behold him, but not nigh. There shall come a star out of Jacob, and a scepter shall arise out of Israel. So picking up that theme of a king, a scepter. Shall smite the corners of Moab, and destroy all the children of Sheth. Edom shall be a possession, Syria shall be the possession for his enemies, and Israel shall do valiantly. Out of Jacob shall come he that shall have dominion, and shall destroy him that remaineth of the city. So he's saying that there's going to come this power in the latter days that is going to be victorious against Moab and against all those who are enemies of Israel. And he concludes in verse 20 with a little piece about Amalek, and says Amalek was the first of the nations, the chief nation, the head, but his latter end shall be that he shall perish forever. Little parable on the Kenites in verse 21 and 22. And then he resumes in verse 23 his look at Amalek. Now remember again, Amalek was that nation that sought to destroy Israel. Amalek, whose chief was Agag or Gog. So verse 23, he took up his parable and said, Alas, who shall live when God doeth this? Ships shall come from the coast of Kittim, and shall afflict Asher, and shall afflict Eber, and he also shall perish forever. So it really is that last verse that we need to tease out. What was this meaning? Alas, when God does this, it's going to be a terrible time on the earth. Ships are going to come from Chittim. Asher's going to be afflicted. Eber's going to be afflicted. And Amalek is going to perish forever. I remember this was written 3,500 years ago. And bear in mind what it said in verse 7, that Israel's king shall be higher than Agag, and Israel's kingdom shall be exalted. Well, Chittim, we understand, is Cyprus. So ships are going to come from the coast of Cyprus, and they're going to afflict Asher. Now, Asher, is the ancient name for Assyria. Now, Eber, we understand, is Israel. So here is some connection somehow between Cyprus, Israel, and Assyria. Brown Briggs drivers say Eber is the region across, usually of a river, and it's used of the ancestor of Abraham. His name was Eber, and Abraham was the one who crossed over the river Euphrates to come to the promised land. And Hebrew means a descendant of Eber. So in my mind, I'm quite confident that when it talks about Eber, it is talking about Israel of the latter days. So we have a time of great trouble. We have some connection with Cyprus, Asher, Israel. Well, we know from what we read in Daniel chapter 11 and also Ezekiel 38 that Gog is going to come forth with many ships. She's moved a lot of her ships into the Mediterranean, but the vast bulk of her ships are in the Black Sea. She's going to come forth to take Turkey, Having taken Turkey, she'll then take Kittim, because Kittim is where the British have their bases. And if you're going to come down into the Middle East, you need to secure your flanks. So this may be the time when the ships of Tarshish are broken, and Gog takes possession of Kittim. And Gog being the latter day Amalekite power that is bent on the destruction of Israel. And then it has to take Asher before going down to Egypt and then coming back and taking Eber. So the interesting thing is, why does he need to take Asher? Because we know from Ezekiel chapter 38 that Persia, modern-day Iran, is the first of Russia's companions. And there's no need to go and conquer Iran because she'll be a partner with Russia. But there does seem to be some need to go into the old territory of Asher. Now, I believe that this is an indication from Scripture that the power of ISIS will remain. Russia is trying very hard to conquer ISIS and drive it back because the Islamic extremists pose a threat to Russia, homeland, and also Russia desires to take Turkey. And in order to take Turkey, as we shall see in a moment, she has to ring Turkey with her troops. And so by going into Syria, that we've seen since last September, and trying to defeat ISIS, it has established herself in Syria. But ISIS it's like a very fluid state, and when ISIS feel they're going to be conquered, they just melt away in the night and disappear and reappear somewhere else and do some more terrorist attacks in Europe. So it's a very fluid situation. I believe that Scripture is telling us that Russia and America are not going to succeed in defeating ISIS. It is a power that remains in the region there and is the reason why Balaam, in one of the oldest of parables, prophecies, is telling us that having dealt with Cyprus, having dealt with Turkey by implication, having come through with many ships, it has to deal with a power sitting where Asher was in the past. So is ISIS the king of the north, Gog the invader of Israel? No. The king of the north has to have links with the Roman Empire, and through the Greek Orthodox Church, Russia has that connection, and coming together with Europe to come against Israel. As Ezekiel 38, we have a recreation of the old Roman Empire. ISIS' role, I believe, is to bring Russia into the Middle East. God often uses powers. Communism was used by God for nearly 70 years as a holding back of Russia. Soon as communism disappeared, then church and state rose together, and we have a transformation of Russia as it was in the time of the Tsars. That was God's intention. That's what Daniel chapter 4, the flourishing of the Babylonian tree, that's what was prophesied in Daniel chapter 4. So here again is a power that God uses to be a bait to bring Russia down into the Middle East to deal with. It's not their role to be the destroyer of Israel. It's just their role to be the bait that helps to bring Russia down, will be dealt with, and then Russia can move forward into Egypt, secure the southern flank, and then move up into Israel. So, an irritant. And also, she has a role to prevent Iran from expanding too much. Iran has very strong territorial ideas. She wants to be a superpower. She wants to be the dominant power, whereas Scripture says you're a companion to Gog. Gog is the main power. Don't get too big for your boots. And so we see at the moment Iran trying to influence herself in Pakistan and Afghanistan. We see her working in Iraq and in Syria. She was flirting with Turkey. That has collapsed because that's not the right idea. So we see Iran establishing herself as a power to the north of Israel and plonking herself at one end of it, as it were, is ISIS, which is like a boil, a sore, preventing Iran moving into Turkey, because that's not her role at all. That's for Russia to do. So I believe that ISIS is there as a power raised up by God with a role to do in these latter days. Now, just before we look at the situation in the Middle East, and we nearly are at the end, so if you're getting a little bit restless, I just want to just use a map that I'll probably be using many times on my trip here. Just the movements of Russia into the Middle East. Her destination is Jerusalem, but before Jerusalem has to come Constantinople. And I say for millennia, they wanted to take Constantinople. What happened in 1453 when Arabs took over the holy city was a great devastation to the Russian people. And Putin makes it quite clear that he wants to take control of Constantinople. But we have seen since 1993, just after the overthrow of communism, the Russian bear beginning to take steps. And it's only when you see it just building up on a map that you appreciate just how much we have seen the Russian bear move forward. So there were tentative steps in 1993. What you have to appreciate, you can't see on here, is that behind Georgia here are the Caucasus Mountains. And there are really only two passes through the Caucasus Mountains that allow, this is Russia on that side there, access to this side. And in 1993, she began to plant a footstep on the Georgian side of one of the passes. And then in 2008, she reinforced that seizure of the land to the north there, and also secured the other passageway in 2008. Very crafty, the whole world was looking at the Olympic Games, the opening of the Olympic Games, and he chose that moment to move into Georgia. And those two areas in Georgia are virtually Russian enclaves. They use Russian passports, Russian money. They're virtually Russian territory. So it's already secured the two passes that are necessary. If you're going to come into Turkey, you've got to come over the Caucasus Mountains unless you come by sea. So those are already secured. So that was 2008. And then in 2014, we saw the taking of Ukraine and the eastern part of Ukraine. We have several brothers and sisters that live in that area. Life is very difficult for them because Russia is in control there. If they want to visit their brothers and sisters in the rest of Ukraine, they have to go through customs and all the rest of it. Life is very tough. They're very poor. They used to be able to go out foraging in the autumn time to get food. Now the forests are mined, so they can't go. Many of the windows in the apartments, and you've seen pictures of the concrete blocks that the communists put up, they're all heated centrally from a big power plant that heats the whole of the little town. You see these huge heating pipes snaking all around. Well, all the heating's out, windows are broken, so imagine what life is like in a cold, not warm winters that you have here. It gets very cold in Ukraine. It's been very tough for them. So that was 2014-15. Also in 2014, the little strip of land, Transnistria, and Putin established an airport there which would take big transporter planes. So he got Ukraine covered to the east, covered to the west. And then 2015, last year and this year, has been reinforcing his position on Crimea, building that into a front seat, as it were, with aircraft, ships, troops, training them. It was from there that they went to Syria. At the beginning of 2015, he secured port rights in Cyprus so that he can use the port facilities. And then in 2015-16, we've seen his footprints in Syria, and he has a very strong naval force off the coast there, rivaling the NATO one. And we've seen him build more and more bases in Syria. There's a base in Iran, there's a base in Iraq. So these are all new movements. We saw in September, October of last year how he used small naval ships to fire cruise missiles all over Iran, Iraq, and into Syria, into ISIS positions. And then, more recently, at the beginning of the year, he's establishing those two bases to the north of Ukraine on Russian territory, but is rebuilding old bases, strengthening them there. Also this year, in 2016, he's made defence agreements with Armenia. He has crack troops in Armenia. He's also building a base in Russian territory to the north of Ukraine. And so, you know, he's more or less got Turkey ringed. The only area that isn't covered is to the west, to Greece. And what he's looking for is for Greece to be kicked out of the EU, which will probably happen fairly soon, because Greece is bankrupt and the EU, now Britain has left, is going to go through very turbulent times. And so he's just waiting to pick up the pieces. And the interesting thing is that Europe is prepared to sacrifice Greece, because Greece is Greek Orthodox, it's not Roman Catholic. It's not the same. And in actual fact, Greece and some of these little countries are in the wrong leg. We know that there is an eastern leg and a western leg, and in the Russian leg belongs Greece. Now at the moment she's in the eastern leg, in the western leg. She's got to be drawn into the eastern leg. And we can see with the situation at the moment, with Greece being bankrupt, being chucked out of the EU, the Russian bear will come and plant his footprints there. And then Turkey will be completely surrounded. So ISIS gave him that opportunity to put troops into Syria, establish bases there in preparation for noosing, as it were, Turkey. Just at the moment, there has been a rapprochement between Turkey and Russia. The Turkish leader is going to visit Putin next month, but we know what is going to happen, that Turkey's fate is sealed. She's got to come under the Russian control. So ISIS has a role to play, and Russia's attempt to deal with ISIS has brought her into that area. And that's how God raises up people and powers. They have a purpose, God uses them, and then disappear off the scene. So we see Iran to the north, and just to complete this picture, what is so interesting is to see the gathering of the nations to the south in opposition, a king of the south power, which Saudi Arabia at the moment is the dominant power there. They're bringing in Jordan. Those countries ringed are in the Gulf Cooperation Council. They're bringing Jordan in. They're wanting to bring Egypt in to enlarge the area. They're working with Israel. They want to bring Yemen in. Yemen at the moment is influenced by Iran. Iran has forces there. They're trying to eliminate Iran from Yemen in order that she might come into this grouping of southern nations in opposition to Iran and eventually in opposition to what Gog does. So it's so interesting to see how many balls, as it were, the angels have up in the air at the moment. This grouping of a north-south split in the Middle East. With Brexit now, Britain's role in the Middle East will grow, along with India and the Commonwealth countries, Australia and New Zealand. They have a vital role to play in this region. And all the while as that is taking place, we have developments in the north. So I'll just put those maps there. Saudi Arabia seems to be the dominant power at the moment in the south. Iran to the north with ISIS dropped in there. But it's a situation that's in the north, which going on at the same time, we see the reshaping of Europe with Britain having got out. And I believe many of these countries down the side here, which are part of the EU, have got to be drawn to Russia, and they've got to belong to the eastern leg. And I believe that we shall see Russia moving to take Greece and those countries there, Ukraine and Turkey. And that will then give us the dragon power and the beast power. And those powers are going to take over Iran. So Iran is not the dominant power, it is the Gogian power to the north. So all these things are all happening at the same time, brothers and sisters. So as far as we're concerned, as a community, we haven't got to wait to see Israel invaded by Gog. We haven't got to see Turkey invaded by Russia. The next event, as far as we're concerned, is the return of our Master. And so these things should excite us to see, well, yeah, the Bible prophecy is true. The things that our earlier brothers and sisters had seen, things that my father used to write about in the early copies of Milestones, they're now coming to pass. And although there seemed a period when everything was going wrong, when Britain joined the EU, again, we can see that, well, God had a purpose. Britain had to join the EU for a purpose, to hold back the EU from coming together as a political power. Now Britain is outside. We shall see Germany and France very rapidly coalescing, coming together as a political power to form the beast system on the territory of the old Holy Roman Empire. And so these things are happening, brothers and sisters, before our eyes. We know the angels are working out there. We know the angels are working in our lives. And we're so close to the coming of the Master that we'll be so foolish to throw everything away by getting entrenched in the affairs of this world. We are servants of the Lord Jesus Christ. He gave his whole life in service to his God. And that should be our service to our Master. Especially as we can see the signs that his coming is so near. That the day of resurrection, the day of judgment is just round the next corner. So brothers and sisters, ISIS, a little bit of a distraction really. But we can see Balaam, that ancient prophecy, talking about the need to come into Asher. Well, that's never made sense until just the last few years. So we can see that God really does know everything. So who are we to doubt that God knows what we need? He will look after us. He will take care. If we put our trust in him, he will bring us to his kingdom. And so we pray, brothers and sisters, come quickly, Lord Jesus.